Welcome back. So now what I want to do is show you some basic rendering techniques and practice. So a lot of times I will get in and just start doing thick to thin lines, and I don't think people always understand exactly what I'm doing. So if I throw a line from point A to point B like this, I'm not putting a ton of pressure there, but even if I did, I can only get so much thickness from a pencil like this or one of the mechanical mechanical pencils that I use. So what I want you to understand is that I'm actually resculpting the line with multiple strokes. Sometimes I'm probably moving a little bit faster where it's less noticeable, and maybe you think I'm just extending the line, but I'm not. I'm actually moving over a little bit as I do that. So I'll see people share their work, and they do a series of lines like this, and they have a little bit of thickness, and they get this big block of shadow above it. And they're wondering why they're not getting a fade. So the spacing would be too far apart here. The thickness, just take this as a for example, if I keep adding thickness to the end of these, and then I obviously have to blend it to the tip to get a sense of taper. If not, I'll get a very blunt edge. Look how as that comes together, it starts to look like a fade by itself. That's the idea, really, as simple as that is. Now, sitting here and cross-hatching isn't a bad thing. I do it randomly all the time, just like that. But I think it does help relate a bit better when we work off shapes. So let me go ahead and drop in a couple shapes here, and then we'll render off of those, and hopefully that will give you an opportunity to practice this a bit better. So a cone is a good shape to practice. Cylinder. And it's a cube-like shape. Okay, something like that. And still don't discount doing this either. You can kind of warm up off to the side. So another way I like to think about rendering is thickening up the line horizontally. Now it's tilted to me, but I always pull at a bit of an angle. So or most of the time I do. So I'm pulling this way, but then I'm going to slowly thin these lines out, and I'm also going to slowly widen them away from one another. And you can see that's really what I did here on the second row that I did. It's a similar concept. And then I might get in here and say, well, I want to make the middles just a little thicker. I'm going to create a secondary pattern right through there. It's real, slight, but it's there. Maybe I'll add one more thicker one, just to darken that up a bit. So you see what I mean? There's a few different ways to look at this. And then you have the different angles. I also like to play around with a technique where I break the lines up as I'm pulling to the thinner side. So let me, I'll show you on the cone here actually. So there's another set of ideas with this stuff is like, do I want the rendering to further enhance the smoothness of an object? Or do I want it to appear more textured? Do I want it to appear more rigid and gritty and all these things, right? In which case, lots of little imperfections and texture is really the way to go. So I'll show you a couple examples here. So for this one, let's just say that we have a light source that, say that the back of this is in shadow, right about here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a bulk of shadow through here, okay? And then I'm going to render up the sides like this. And I'm going to try to give it a little bit of a specularity kind of vibe. Okay, so that's my goal here. So shadow through here. You can draw the shadow, you can sketch it. Generally, when you draw the shadow, you're going to get a more concise shape. So for something that's specular, that probably makes sense, I guess. I mean, I guess it doesn't really matter because you could go for swirling shapes of shadows, which really is what you'd see. I'll do a little bit of that. So I'll put like a little swirl here, something like that. And as it breaks down into this one, I'll bring that shadow back up like that. So that kind of looks like, to me, it looks like something that would be reflective and shiny. Something like that. There we go. So there's our basic kind of core shadow. I want this to be more about rendering, but it all ties together. So here what I'm going to do is I'm going to take thick to thin lines. Remember, again, what I mentioned about tapering these. Multiple strokes, as many as you need. You're more, at this point, you're more worried about the shape that you're generating of this textured rendering more than, I don't know, efficiency of how many strokes it takes. You don't get too caught up in that. It's the look you're after. And really tightening up the edge that's closer to the shadow, bringing that nice and close together so that it creates a sense of a feeling of a gradient, a feeling of a transition of dark to light. But if they're not close enough together, it sort of falls apart, I think. I guess it's dependent upon the style you like, but that's the idea, is that I'm trying to get that fade right there. I can further enhance that by cross-hatching. I like to make these lines thinner, but that's preference. They don't have to be thinner. It's just, again, an idea that I tend to think about there. And then to reinforce this shape on the page, you see it's just floating there. I could start to render some shadows onto a ground plane. And if I'm basically, so to me what I'm trying to explain here, what I'm developing in this illustration, is that the light source is on the sides or the opposite side of this, really the opposite side of this. I could even render a little bit over here. I'd keep it kind of light, but I could definitely do that. I could even render a little bit there. But again, what I'm trying to explain, and what I'm trying to envision here, is that the light is on the opposite side. So based on that, and since it's spherical, it's not going to have a significant defined edge shadow. It's a cone, right? So if the light's over here on the opposite side of this cube-like prism, you could really fill this all in because this particular plane is directly facing away from the light source. Where this, it's not so easy. It's spherical, so you have to picture, if it's spherical and it's specular, that chances are it's going to catch some light on the sides in one way or another. So again, I'm going to render this way now. I'll just start really light. I'll also put a, you know what, I've got my ruler here. I'll just go ahead and put a line right behind these. And now we've got something to relate to. Okay. And so for here, I will take these and I'll go a little bit lighter. So this is another thing you might want to think about. What value are you shooting for? Are you shooting for a dark value, a light value? How many values do you want in your work? Do you want like dark, medium, light? Do you want more than that? So all of these little lines that you generate, then it comes down to pressure. It comes down to what kind of pencil are you using. This is actually a 2H lead, but on my sketchbook it does appear darker, I've noticed. So if I do the same lead on Strathmore 200 series, for whatever reason, it is significantly lighter. I can press down pretty hard on this and get a really dark line where I don't seem to do that as well in Strathmore. But but you also control it with just your hand weight and the amount of pressure that you're applying. That's the main thing. So yeah, so now we've got the edge of this cone-like shape. We can cross hatch into here. Again, you could play around with this. You could do multiple levels of cross hatching, but I do want to keep it a little bit lighter. And then I could always go back and darken more into this. I believe it's called a core shadow, but the shape of shadow here. I could add more of these little swirls. Remember with these to not just draw straight lines, and if they are too even, thicken an area up. Add a little bump in there, and then blend that bump into the curve. And you can generally get something that looks a little more chrome-like. You could add like a little specularity highlight to the edge. You can even erase back the line where the light is hitting more predominantly. It kind of gives resembles light glaring off the side. Just think about when something's glaring off the side, how it's hard for you to look at. It's kind of a similar concept, right? So you can like break that line up where the light looks like it's basically washing away that edge. And so now, and you could add a different value to the table as well. It's just good to think about all of these areas as a variety of values. So you experiment more with it. So you try to generate different lines at different thicknesses, different weights, intensities, pressure, all those things to get like a nice spectrum of these variations. So let's go and start on the cylinder here. So now with this one, I'll go for something that is just not as shiny, even though cylinders are really good opportunity to do shiny and specular renderings because of the spherical nature of it. But you could have a shiny cube as well. It's this, you just want to play around with all this. So first off, I'll think about the light source here, and it would give you this shadow perspectively away from the light source, right? It radiates like perspective lines, basically, in a simplified manner, representation. And then, so as it gets over here, it's going to hit here, it's going to hit here, right? Something like that. So you basically take the perspective line to the corners, and then you relate that to the ground. Corner, relate that to the ground. So something to that effect, but yeah, I really don't want to make it that distinct. Or maybe we will. I don't think it'll matter, but yeah, let's do that just to keep it easy. So, and to hopefully show you more along this lines of, pick your light source, use a ruler if you have to, bring it to here, and you could carry it all the way through and do this long shadow. But I'm just going to blend it off. So instead of bringing that shadow way out here, I'm going to widen it. And on this one, I'm going to fade that off. Because I think that's another thing that's helpful to show you with the rendering here, that they don't all have to be shapes. You don't want to get too much into a shape-based way of thinking. Sometimes you just want gradients and fades. Okay, so with this one, I'm going to start by adding a coarse shadow on the back. Now, again, there could be bounce light as well. That's really what this area is, by the way. When you see another kind of dimly lit area to the side of something, that's bounce light. And you're going to get that on anything chrome, anything specular, you even get it on skin quite a bit. So, but with something spherical, you kind of have to imagine that not the entire back isn't going to be, you're going to darken in this entire back. It's going to flatten it right out. So I'm going to take it to about here. Like that. And then for the sides here, I'm going to start to blend off going parallel to the shadow. Okay. And then I'm actually going to render in the opposite direction as well. Sorry if my hand's covering this. I still have not figured out how I can shoot this without my hand getting in the way. Try it on an angle, but then I feel like it distorts the artwork. Okay, so like that. And then another good thing to practice is rendering around the form in the same direction as you're imagining the volume and the form to go. So if this is a spherical cylindrical object, then you're going to curve those lines around. And forgive me, I'm doing this awkward because I really don't want to tilt the page on you if I don't have to. But that means I have to crank my hand over to the side. I can do it though. And so you would use the edging of the, so the perimeter right there, use that as a reference point. I probably have these a little too far apart, but I don't want this to be too much of a perfect gradient in this example, so I don't mind it here. And notice I brought them across more on the base, something I like to do there. I feel like it. I feel like another thing that we have to be careful of is not to render so evenly all throughout where it can still flatten out the work. So you have to like imagine that these bits of rendering can take shape and they can have their own characteristics. They can have a lot of variation to them. So that's why you see me doing some that are longer through the middle. They got shorter on both sides and longer. And I just feel like it looks more organic versus something that's too rigid of a idea or too repetitive. So we could also shadow up here. Now I feel like the top would get a lot of light, but we could add just a tiny bit, just so it's not plain, totally void of rendering. And then for the next part, I'm going to fade that shadow off. Getting my pencil sharpened here, using a rotary sharpener, by the way. Like so. And so now I'll render this way. Now, if I was really careful, I could probably render this entirely just with this one row of lines and going thick to thin, because it actually achieves my goal all by itself. Like I'm trying to envision that the shadow stays heavier and then blends away as it fades across this table or whatever it is. So these thick to thin radiating lines pretty much do that by themselves. I could also break these apart a little bit. I'm going to do that in the next example, so I won't do too much of that here, but it's something else I can do. In fact, one way I like to do it is with whiteout. When I'm inking something, I like to do these little line breaks with the whiteout. It's a lot easier. I don't know, I just feel like there's a good sense of control there. But you could start to implement them here so that the ideas are, they're already on the page, or you're already starting to work through these concepts as like almost, I tend to think all this like notes. You're just taking visual notes. So just like that, I feel like that fade by itself works. I could darken the edges a little bit. I could do all sorts of things, I guess. I could render a little bit, but I'm not going to do a whole lot of it. But just, if I want to add a little bit of cross-hatching, give it a little more style, that's easy enough to do. And I can also darken the side that's away from the light, put a little bit of heavier light source Now, I'm sorry, heavier line weight, not light source. The light source would be over here. Remember, if I wanted to give it the effect that the light was hitting here, I could thicken the line weight around and have it get thinner to this point. Likewise here, I could start thicker at the bottom, get thinner at the top. All that would kind of help. If I wanted to really push it, I could use some white out or erase back, and I could show just like a broken up line right there to really push that effect. Now I know I have the light source over here. I originally was just trying to illustrate that point, but probably at the top at this point, if the light was right here, wouldn't hit the side as much. But I'm just going to go ahead and leave that for now. And so now for this next one, I want to show you how you introduce a bit more texture into this way of thinking. So again, still practicing rendering, but in this case we will add more texture. So since it's a the planes of this object are very defined, obviously, right? Very discernible. It becomes a lot easier to render. You could really just start as simple as something like this. I could just block that all in, but I'm not going to do that. I want to show you with just rendering, but I could use some simple lines like that. I can say, well, I need it to be darker though, so I'll render in a different direction. Now you see I'm not using any interesting lines yet, but there is a time and a place even for this style. And you can always add to it. I'm going to go and go in a third direction now. But you see, each time I add that next direction, it gets a little darker, right? Well, then I can go back and I could say, well, I'm just going to thicken up some areas here and there. See that? I mean, and you just play around with this. Some people get really good at this. This isn't really my preferred method, but again, I want to show you a variety of ways to implement this. So now we got our light source over here. I would say that this side's not totally in the light. It's more on the other opposite plane that we can't see, but it is getting some light. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to start with this same effect. And here I'm going to start to break the lines up. So my big hand isn't in the way here. So as I get to this light source side, I'm just going to break them apart. You really can play around with this. It can be a lot messier than you would think. I'm often amazed by, when I see people do it, and I'm thinking, man, they're really being a little too messy, and then it comes together really nice at the end. It's more about having an idea of the values and the texture that you're trying to create, I think, more than some sense of cleansely perfect lines. Like, you could sit here and ruler every line, but I think it would look worse, not better. So again, I'm going to hit this next angle, but now I'm going to really start to break these up a bit. So for me, I think that these broken lines look more interesting. They give more texture. And remember what we said about the other part, it kind of resembles a sense of lighting as well. And I feel like I have to be careful not to make them too big. I almost feel like I already did. Because if you notice, the wider I make these, the darker it gets, which I can't really make this side look darker than this side. So what I'm going to do is try to fix that by going back over to here and adding some thickness to this corner. Because this back side needs to be darker. So you got to be a little bit strategic about what you're doing here. But again, I'm paying more attention to value than anything. You know, what's darker, what's lighter, why is it that way? Where is it in relationship to the light? Stuff like that. And then also, as I mentioned, little imperfections, right? Little textures, little bumps. This stuff adds so much to the work. And it's kind of funny too, because all you're doing, or at least what it seems like to me, if I had to wrap my head around the idea that, well, you know, I'm kind of messing it up. And you're not messing it up. You're making it more interesting, but I don't know. It's just in the beginning, I think that I was really focused on trying to make things too clean, and it was hurting my work, not helping it. These imperfections, these textures they add character. And if you're going to draw things like broken up concrete or any number of things, anything rustic, anything really, almost anything has more texture than we might, you know, particularly envision at first. When we're first trying to draw it and process it in our minds, we tend to think it's a little cleaner than it actually is, I think. Okay, so a little bit of texture on the top, or rendering I should say, just some thin lines, nothing too major. You can also get on the very edges and render into some of those little imperfections. All sorts of ways you can add character to this. You know, even on the back, just probably wouldn't notice as much there. And then what I could do is just say, all right, at the very end, maybe another little pass through the back here because it just feels a little too light. And then the shadows. So again, here's the light source. I would pinpoint the edge and bring that out. Pinpoint the other edge. And so you could probably say, well, wouldn't the light hit here and cast down? I've seen people look at it that way. I'm just going to find the very edge and bring the line back. Just like that. And then like that. And same thing, I'll just render this out. I'll just do it a little bit differently so that we got some variation here to practice. So feel free to practice this, share it in the Q&A section, share it on social media, tag me in the post, whatever you want to do there. But it's basically something that, you know, can really help you with your rendering. That if you just try these little exercises, and I know these seem like simple forms, like, well, why would I want to sit there and draw a cone and a cylinder and a box? But you really have to remember that these simple forms and shapes relate to everything else that we draw. But also keep in mind, these don't have to be the ones that you go for. You can look at shapes and forms around the house, you know, a bookshelf, coffee mug, coffee cup, and really all that stuff is great food for thought. It all adds to the mileage. I just think that if we start here and we practice these very simplified primitives, we can then carry that through to the other household things and the other, you know, a tree is cylinders but with a lot of cool textures wrapped around it, right? And a lot of cool, interesting details, you know, on top of those series of cylinders. And maybe a tree is not a good example for cylinders, but it has some cylindrical aspects, but then it also has a lot of organic and wiry kind of limbs to it. But it's when you start utilizing all this together and building upon it, you start to realize a lot of it is comprised of basic shapes. So there we go. Hopefully that's helped you. I'll bring you more content like this very soon. Thank you for watching, and good luck with your art.